Hi guys, thank you all so much for being here today. Alright, so we are in a slightly different setting in this video. This right here is the Hauptfriedhof, or the main cemetery in Karlsruhe. It is 146 years old, and in all Germany, this is one of the oldest of its kind. Today we're going to talk about death, from a part scientific, part historic perspective. The book we're looking at is Mary Roach's Stiff, The Curious Lives of Human Cadavers. The term cadaver comes from Latin to fall.
Now, if you're looking to get an understanding of how dead bodies can be used to better enhance our understanding of science, what happens when people are plagued by certain diseases, or for instance, what happens when you don't wear a seatbelt or the impact of bullets on the body. So a little bit about what you can expect off of this video. For starters, I'm going to be touching upon something that I found personally really interesting about the book. And then I'm going to quickly summarize a particular chapter from the book, again, that I found intriguing. And there are 12 such chapters, so it's 1 of 12. So then let's dive right into it. So let's now talk a little bit about what happens immediately after a person dies. There are essentially 5 stages of death. The first one is known as pallor mortis, in which a person's color basically changes. Their face, for instance, becomes paler. The second stage is known as algor mortis, which is characterized by a change in the temperature of the body, which deviates from ambient temperature. The third stage is known as rigor mortis, in which the muscles in the body begin to contract and stiffen up. The fourth stage is known as livor mortis. A person who's lying on their back, for instance, blood will start pooling at that layer, and it gives a bluish or purplish tinge hue to the body. This usually is visible 2 to 3 hours after a person dies. The fifth stage is known as putrefaction, which eventually then leads to decomposition. So there you have it. This is inevitably where all our bodies are going to end up. These are all the stages that each and every single one of us, have to go through. Which takes me to this exceptionally beautiful quote that I came across in the book. It resonated with me long after I did finish reading the book. Here it is.
So, a little context to the quote we are about to see. It is an observation made by the author about a cadaver at the research center of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee. The cadaver is in its earliest stages of putrefaction. It is undergoing autolysis, which is essentially a process in which the body eats itself. Something else is going on. Squirming grains of rice are crowded into the man's belly button. It's a rice grain mosh pit. But rice grains do not move. These cannot be grains of rice. They're not. They're young flies.
So there you have it. That is the inevitable end. We are all going to return to the soil, where our bodies will be preyed upon by insects and larvae and what have you. Unless if you get plastinated. And plastination is a process that I will talk about briefly at the end of this video. So do hang around to learn more about what that is. And now let's continue with a chapter that I found particularly interesting. The question then is, how do you define death? When do you know if somebody is dead? How do you reach that conclusion? In order to answer that question, let's dial things back a little bit. So the ancient Egyptians believed that the heart was the seat of the soul. They thought that the soul was comprised of a variety of different parts in the human body, but primarily it resided in the heart. The immortal soul, or the ka, which they thought was the key to the afterlife. So when a body was mummified, the soul or the heart essentially was remained untouched. What they did with the brain is they liquefied the brain and then they drained it out of the mummy's nostrils. Its liver and its spleen were then stored in different jars. So that was kind of the ancient Egyptian method. And then if we take things on to the ancient Greeks, they did believe that the heart was where the soul was based. Now, of course, that is easy to understand, right? Because the heart is the one organ in the human body that is so animated. It does its lub-dub, right? Very methodically, rhythmically. So it's easy to associate life or soul or animation to that particular organ in the body. Up until 100 to 200 years ago, people were petrified at the idea of being buried alive. And so the physicians of the time had to come up with innovative ways around that, essentially. These involved painful, often humiliating treatments on the dead body. So how did they know back in the 18th and 19th century that someone had indeed truly died? Well, they inserted nails in a person's toenail, for starters, Or they took razors and sliced off the bottom of their soles of the feet. Or they played loud sounds near a person's ear to make sure that they were agitated enough. And then here's this technique of tongue pulling, which was introduced by a French physician called Jean-Baptiste Vincent. What he did is he actually came up with a mechanical crank of sorts to pull at a person's tongue, sometimes in upwards of 3 hours at a stretch, in order to ensure that the person has indeed truly died. Fun fact, there was a something called a waiting mortuary, which is a building in which people's bodies could be stored until it putrefied and gave off this foul odor. And this was one of the most commonly accepted practices to ensure that a person has indeed passed on. So, what is essentially the definition of death? According to something called the whole brain model approach, a person can be considered to be legally dead if their brain functions ceases to exist, and that has to be an irreversible cessation of all brain functions, including the entire brain stem. We also have something called the higher brain approach, which essentially says that a person can be considered to be dead if there is an irreversible cessation of their consciousness, which means waking state, dreaming state, what have you. If that comes to an end, the person can be considered to be legally dead. Now, the traditional view, however, was different from both of these. It is considered the cardiopulmonary approach, i.e. if your heart stops beating, then you're dead. There are, however, some more modern approaches that takes a combinatory route of all of these three. For instance, how do you know when it is right for you to take out the organs of a dead person? How do you know when the doctors can quit basically operating on someone and give up? So this essentially requires a combination of the whole brain approach and the higher brain approach. The reason that this is such an iffy issue is because there is no sharp distinction between life and death. According to a Stanford.edu article that I, by the way, linked down at the bottom of the video, so please do check it out if you're interested in this topic, it basically describes death as a fuzzy set, which does inevitably require a combination of a variety of different approaches in order to truly determine when somebody has died and avoid any legal ramifications. Last but not least, as promised, we are going to be talking about the concept of plastination, which is the preservation of human cadavers for hundreds of years after they have died. The idea is essentially to take an organic tissue, drain it and deplete it completely of its water content, and replace it with a silicone polymer. This technique was developed in the 1970s by a German, Günther von Hagens, and it's very popular. Essentially, he developed an art exhibit out of it, and it's called Körperwelter. And the idea is, you have these bodies that have been artfully assembled and they are on display and they attract millions of spectators on an annual basis. It's a very well-researched, well-rounded book. Do check it out because I personally think that it does help put a lot of things into perspective, and I found that very helpful in that regard. Take care, have a good one. I'm going to see you next time. Bye-bye.